Yeah.
Dude,
What's up?
I almost panicked again.
What do you mean? No, come back in.
We'll talk about it
Did
tomorrow.
you? Okay.
We'll talk about it tomorrow.
I love Panicky Pete Opie.
How you doing, Crispin? Crispin Glover in studio.
Good.
My God,
see
man.
you.
Looking very professor-like. I like
well,
that.
Indeed.
That
I like the look.
The vest and everything.
Indeed.
Corduroy. Very
That's
nice,
right.
sir.
Thank you. Good to
Very
be
nice.
here.
Great to have you. I'm a fan for many years.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, and we were going through your new project that you're working on. Is this It Is Fine, Everything Is Fine?
Well, I'm playing two different films tomorrow night. I'm on a tour around the U.S. right now. People can find out where I am on CrispinGlover.com.
Mm-hmm.
But I have two feature films. I've actually been touring since the year 2005.
Really?
I premiered What Is It, the part one of what will be a trilogy in 2005 at Sundance. And then It Is Fine, Everything Is Fine, I premiered in 2007 Sundance. I'm playing both of them tomorrow and the next day here in New York at the Museum of Arts and Design. And I also perform a live show before the two feature films. I have two different live shows. I feel naked because normally I have my books with me.
Right,
and
yeah.
I fail to have them, but they're profusely illustrated
Yes.
books. I'm very proud of them. The illustrations, every page is projected behind me as I perform an hour-long show. Then I show the film. What is it? Is 72 minutes, or if I'm showing it, Everything Is Fine, that's 74 minutes. After the film, I come out, I have a Q&A with the audience, and then after that, I have a book signing. So it's a long show. It's a little bit why I'm a bit hoarse. I'm in the midst of touring.
Right,
Are the books serious, or are they comedic, or?
They're old books taken from the 1800s that are reworked and turned into different books from what they originally were. They're very heavily illustrated. There's humor in the shows, but it's not like a comedy. People laugh and things, but the first time I ever performed the live show is in *93, so I guess, gosh, that's 20 years ago. I just realized that. I can't even believe it.
So you took books from the 1800s and kind of updated them and made them.
I don't know if "update's" the right word, but I made them into their own things from what they were.
Yeah. Now, obviously, we were watching the. You have a little story that goes along with the pictures.
Yes.
Now, you have these books. You look at these pictures and then come up with some kind of storyline for the pictures?
Yes. I mean, different books came in different ways. I made about 20 of them over the years. Most of these are old. Most of them were done in the 80s and 90s. And I've utilized it as a way to tour with my films to self-distribute the films. And I have recouped on the films, but really the way I've recouped is 50% by the live show, 25% by the box office from the films, and 25% by the book sales.
It gives a live aspect to just watching a movie. And now they get to see you live, have a Q&A. And
I have a genuine interaction with the audience, and people come back. I've had many people come back for many shows over the years, so I have a genuine relationship with the audience. The first film, What Is It? Which I usually played the second film first for various reasons, but the first film, What Is It? Most of the actors have Down syndrome, but the film isn't about Down syndrome at all. What it really is my psychological reaction to the corporate constraints that have happened in the last 30 years of corporately funded and distributed filmmaking, where anything that can possibly make an audience member uncomfortable is necessarily excised, or that film will not be corporately funded or distributed.
Oh my God! So
I think it's a very damaging thing for that to happen, because it's those moments when an audience member looks up at the screen, thinks to themselves, "Is this right? What I'm watching? Is this wrong? What I'm watching? Should I be here? Should the filmmaker have done this? What is it?" And that's the title of the first film. What is it that's taboo in the culture? What does it mean when the taboo has been ubiquitously excised? I think it's very damaging, because when people are asking questions in the etymological term of education, meaning to learn from within, there's real education going on. And instead, I feel like what's happening in our corporately funded and distributed film industry is there are not questions. And what's the opposite of education?
It's more indoctrination.
It's propaganda. Yeah, exactly.
Well, let me ask you, that's an interesting point of view, too, about what's making people uncomfortable. There's been a raging controversy with what is appropriate in comedy, like to make fun of, whether it's racism or rape or anything. Do you think there's anything that people shouldn't make fun of in comedy, or do you think it's all fair?
Well, It is a complicated issue, and my film deals with some of those issues in different ways as well. Ultimately, I think of it more having to do with acting, where it's inappropriate for one person to play another kind of person, and it's understandable because there has been a terrible history which can really lead to horrible things. But I mean, ultimately, I believe everybody should be able to play everybody. But
right.
I mean, art is complex. You could say that the most horrendous things are still artful. So it's a question of what your purpose is, really.
You're right there, because if you think of and look at Tom Hanks playing Forrest Gump,
right,
that's completely acceptable and looked at as a very dramatic and wonderful thing. But then if you take somebody that's known as an offbeat prop comic and they play that part, it might look exploitive. And you're trying to make fun of it instead of trying to kind of tribute.
Yeah. In the film, what is it? The actors that have Down syndrome are not necessarily playing characters that have Down syndrome, and that in of itself strangely has a taboo quality.
Absolutely, yeah.
If you see, sometimes people think that I'm saying that it's taboo to have actors with Down syndrome in a film. It isn't. You'll see that in television shows, but what you won't see are actors with Down syndrome playing characters that do not necessarily have Down syndrome.
They always play someone with Down syndrome.
And on top of that, if somebody with either a developmental disability or a disability is playing a character, for the most part, they're playing a benevolent character.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's fair enough. There's plenty of people with disabilities that are benefactors to the society. But the second film that I made, It Is Fine, Everything Is Fine, is written by one of the people that was in what is it? He doesn't have Down syndrome, but he was born with a severe case of cerebral palsy. His name's Stephen C. Stewart. And when he was in his early 20s, his mother died. He was very difficult to understand. And he ended up being put into a nursing home where he did not want to be. And the people that were taking care of him there would derisively call him an MR, a mental retard, which isn't a nice thing to say to anybody, but Steve was of normal intelligence, and the emotional turmoil he must have gone through for the decade he was in that nursing home, I can't even begin to imagine. When he got out, he wrote this screenplay in the style of a 1970s TV murder mystery of the week, wherein he's the bad guy. And this was something very important to Steve, along what we were just talking about. He wanted to play a bad guy because he thought of himself as a person, of course, with a disability, but stressing on a person, people can have dark thoughts, whether they have a disability or not. So he wanted to play a bad guy. He considered himself he would have called himself a handicapped rights activist back in the 70s. But this film, when there's something about that he wrote it in this genre style, as opposed to a standard autobiography, it brings out certain truths in his lives that really, when the whole trilogy is done, this film will be the best film of the trilogy. But not only that, I feel like it'll be the best film I'll have anything to do with in my whole career. I'm very passionate about the film.
Don't you feel you're giving people much too much credit? Because this could be interpreted as your intentions being, kind of not like you're doing this to get a rise out of people instead of what you're doing. Now, your intent, obviously, when you explain it, it makes perfect sense. But people never want to get that deep into things.
Well, this is why I've been touring for so long. I have not put these films out digitally specifically because I'm aware of exactly what you're saying, particularly with What Is It? Because Steve wrote Everything Is Fine, there are certain things that become very self-apparent. But I am with every screening of the film, and I have a Q&A. It's not that I want to explain everything about the film, but I do want to put it into context.
Right.
So I'm very careful about that.
Was it hard working with actors with Down syndrome? I mean, was that difficult?
No, they were great. I mean, of course, it was written specifically for people with Down syndrome, and I wanted to incorporate anything organic that happened. The films took me a long time to make, but it had nothing to do with that. It just had to do with that I financed them myself, and that I had a very bad bad technical problem on the first film. But no, I actually shot the first film. It was over a period of 2.5 years and 12 days. So it's a very short amount of days to shoot a feature film. They were great. The most important thing, whether somebody has Down syndrome or not, is if somebody has enthusiasm for the project. And everybody I worked with had great enthusiasm, so I had a great time working with them. And part 3 will go back to working with people with Down syndrome.
Did you change over the years from working in Hollywood, or in the beginning of your career, you were accepting more roles that I guess would be considered more, publicly accepted roles?
Well, I mean, what do you mean?
I'm just saying, did you go into the entertainment business, as many people do? Hey, I love doing this, but I also want some kind of fame and wealth and notoriety.
It's a good question. My father's an actor. His name's Bruce Glover. In fact, the next film that I make, I own property in the Czech Republic, an old chateau that was built in the 1600s, and next to it's a horse stables, and I'm building sets right now. The last year and a half, I've been having sets built on about 14,000 square feet, and I'm making something for myself and my father to act in together. We've never acted together before, but I grew up on some level around the industry. I became an actor professionally at age 13. It was something I decided to do on my own, and I thought of it as basically a prudent business decision. It wasn't something where I thought, my father wasn't super famous or anything, but I saw that it was a good living, basically, and I understood how it worked, and I realized it was something that I could do. So on some level, I've always had a relatively realistic point of view about how the business works. When I was 16, I learned to drive. I studied professionally from age 15 till 20. When I was 16, I learned how to drive, and I went to go to all of the art house movie theaters that were popular in Los Angeles at the time. And this was 1980, and most of the films that I was seeing were films from the 1970s, 60s, but films from the 20s, 30s. But what I was noticing were these great films that were asking questions, and I was really excited about that. And I thought, what a great form of art to be entering into.
What would be an example of one of those movies? Because I'm trying to think.
I don't know. 5 Easy Pieces with Jack Nicholson, Easy Rider, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Clockwork Orange. Movies that are making you think about things.
Yeah, when the credits start rolling at the end, you're like, okay, I can't just leave this alone here.
Yeah, exactly. And you revisit it in your mind. You can go back and watch it years later, and you get different thoughts. I love that, and that's what I aspire to do in my own filmmaking. That's what as a young actor, I was excited to be a part of. But in the early '80s, I talk about this a lot at the shows. I can tell it starts to get political, and I hate to get overly political about things, but I can see that there were things that started to change in what kind of films were being funded and distributed. I was thinking, where are all these questions that I wanted to be a part of? And I can go into a lot of detail about it, but it's really taken me to make my own films to feel satisfied about it. I think sometimes there are films that still ask questions, but for the most part, right now, we're in a pretty highly propagandized culture.
Do you think that they ask? It seems like what films do now is they ask a question, and then they give you. They ask what they seems like a tough question, but then they give you a very palate-pleasing answer by the end of it. Like, they don't ask anything tough, but they might go into the guise of asking a tough question, but they answer it for you in a perfectly acceptable way.
Well, I would say virtually everything is propaganda, and what I mean by that is if there's a real question that's going to cause people to genuinely ask things that could possibly hurt corporate interests, those questions will not be film will not be funded or distributed. I mean, I've started to say this in kind of a vague outline of what I would say the main force of U.S. Corporate propaganda is to essentially make people in the United States feel relatively comfortable with the concept of wars abroad and killing, various nations, as though the United States was a moral police force around the world, and that's the main thrust of everything. But you have to look at metaphor. So it's not like those films say it directly. Right. It might be done as a lone vigilante movie or a superhero movie where the concept is that this is a really good force and there's these outside elements that are bad forces. And if you look at other countries, there are not so many countries that do things like superhero movies and that kind of thing. It's a weird topic for me to get into because I do work in the industry.
Right.
And I mean, I've certainly been part of what I would call this propaganda. But I feel like it's healthy to talk about, and I think to be afraid of talking about it isn't a good thing. I don't want people in the industry to think I'm this like ne'er-do-well who doesn't want to have anything to do with anything. If I was offered a superhero movie, I'd do it. You know, it's not. Yeah. But I think it's and my experience is that the people working in the film industry are good people that want to do interesting things and want interesting questions. But there's a systematization that's happened. There's something that's put in place, and people feel concerned about if they try to get something that really asks questions or does something, either they won't get the film made or they'll lose their job or whatever. And I do think that there's corporate interests that are very much controlling things, and it's something that these kind of like, I hate to become overly political, but things like the Occupy movement, which of course is a complex movement, but there are questions or political elements that should be dealt with to probably reform how money in politics is how money is affecting politics right now, which ultimately is that corporations have a lot of control, including our media.
Over everything, pretty much. Yeah. But there is room, though, a lot of room for films that do ask questions and aren't just corporate propaganda. I don't think they're as the big money makers. You know, they're not the major.
This is something I disagree with. People often say, well, the kinds of movies, the reason that they're funded is because this is what people want to see. That I don't agree with that. I think that the reason that the films are funded and they're highly distributed is because they are corporate interests. So therefore, people go see them. If the same kind of money was put into a movie and distributed, then people would go see them. And I say the last 30 years, for example, something like 2001: A Space Odyssey or The Godfather, you know, I mean, or Clockwork Orange or Full Metal Jacket. These are films that did well. They asked a lot of questions, but there was a shift in what was funded, starting somewhere around the 1980s. And I mean, 2001: A Space Odyssey, that's a pretty obscure, very odd type of film. It's incredible filmmaking. It's my favorite kind of filmmaking. But that was not just some small independent film. That was an MGM giant studio film. There's a shift in what's being funded, and it would be nice if things would shift back toward that. I don't see that happening right now.
Not right now. I think it's all cyclical at some point, though. It will come back around. Things do kind of change like that. What do you think about your image in Hollywood and stuff? Because people would call you at the very least eclectic many times in the projects you've been involved in. Yeah. Does that bother you, or do you think about it?
Like eccentric is something I hear a lot.
Sure.
Eccentric meaning the not following a mathematical term, meaning not following the straight line, which is fine. You know, artistically, I like to go into areas that are unusual and thoughtful. I'm okay with that, and I get more concerned in terms of just within the business that people will think I'm like this kind of person that would be difficult to work with. That I don't like. But that isn't the case. I've been working for over 30 years. I've worked with many people over and over again. I as much as I have questions about these things, I'm very grateful to be part of the film industry. It's let me fund my films. It's let me have the time to tour with the films and meet the people that are interested in what I'm doing. So I do get concerned about that. I know that on some level my public persona is that of this kind of almost psychotic person, and I'm not. But I've never really gone out on like some public relations tour to try to fix that. I've always been relatively comfortable with it because my artistic interests go into areas that I want to go as whatever it needs needs to be to get to some interesting, thoughtful place.
Right.
But as far as business, I mean, I made these films, I tour with these films. I have to be very centric as a filmmaker and as a business person. So in reality, I am a centric business person and eccentric, perhaps, artist.
I think people have the impression, though, that you go into a business meeting and just start bouncing off the walls and whatnot.
Probably. Yeah. I mean, that's what probably people think. But it would. How would I have
right? How would you get to this point?
Or worked as long as I have?
How would you dress yourself in the morning?
That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You should put that, like, if you do put this stuff online or release it on DVD, because you like to explain it at the end. Would you have some kind of an explanation in a video where you could put online where you could kind of have that feeling to it?
I don't foresee that I'll do it. The trouble now with digital, and the music industry has been, the CD industry specifically has been decimated because of piracy, and I'm concerned for the corporate film world. I wish there was this is an area where I really wish they were going in and to the politicians and saying, come on, let's get some laws figured out about how to regulate this. Of course, it would have to be international, but I'm concerned about what will happen in the future. I can recoup on my films, which everything is fine with $200,000 budget to get to a 35 millimeter print. It has a great production value for that. I'm very proud of it, but it's a very relatively low cost for film. I've been able to recoup, but when you're talking about tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, if piracy gets to the point where people can just download a high quality film in seconds, why people justify that and they go, okay, well, I'm going to do it. How will the film industry then recoup? I don't understand.
They always find a way. It's really weird. Like with Lars and Napster, they found a way. Like they always it gets pirated for a while, but then they always find a way to put a digital stop to it. Like
but it didn't because I mean the CD sales have essentially stopped. The way musicians make their money now is by touring.
Right.
It truly switched that industry around. And I'm touring with my film, so that's, again, how I'm doing. But I wonder what's going to happen once you can get a 20 gigabyte full-bodied film downloaded in seconds. Why would anybody go pay for the same thing when they can just get a digital theater at home for $1,000 and the rest of the life they're set to have free entertainment? I mean,
are CD sales suffering, or is it because I know CDs themselves are doing terrible because the clunkiness of it.
Yeah,
but is the music sales, meaning like? I always thought artists would do well on iTunes because there's so little overhead.
I think it's making a little bit of a comeback.
Yeah, because there's no overhead whatsoever.
But there are a few years where Crispin Glover's point is accurate.
I think it's. I'm not an expert, but I think it's okay. It isn't at the height that it ever was before, but also you have to figure it is different with music. You can make an album relatively inexpensively. Of course, you can spend a lot of money on an album, but you don't have to. Whereas even the least expensive film, you're going to spend a lot of money. Right. So it's like if DVDs start becoming, or the digital download for a film becomes free, and somebody's trying to justify whether they're going to spend $20 on a DVD or just download it on some site, and they don't have to pay for parking, and they can project it digitally at home. What's the choice?
Well, no one's going to make a movie for $200 million. Is your point?
Well,
why would you do that?
Yeah,
the risk would be too great.
I would think. I don't know. I'm part of the industry. I want it to be okay. And then, of course, my own concerns about my films. But this is a big part of why I personally have no plans to put it out digitally, because it would just. I've been touring for 8 years. It took me 6 years to get to the point of recoupment. If I'd put it out on DVD, it would have been all over the internet, and I wouldn't have been able to recoup.
With that said, when part of you has to think, man, I wish more eyes would see my project, right?
Yeah, well, particularly everything is fine. I am very protective of what is it. Like, I don't want clips of it around on the internet. I'm protective of the actors.
How many people do you think have seen your film?
Thousands, but not hundreds of thousands. Of course, I'd rather hundreds of thousands.
And you're okay with that?
Well, I'm a practical business person.
But there's a weird
level.
balance there. I understand what you're saying, but there's also the ego that you want to feed a little bit. Like, I wish more people saw this.
There is that part of me, but I'm a realist ultimately, and even like I was describing how I entered the business, it's like on some level business first. And I've essentially recouped, but it's like really specifically, I've only recouped a quarter by the box office. It's mostly been by the live show, which means if at 6 years, it would be about 24 years of touring. So maybe at the point that I've genuinely recouped, I'll say, okay, now it's time to generally release it.
Or when you move on to another project officially in your mind, you're like, okay, I'm done with this, like Jimmy does.
Well,
you put out your stand-up specials and like, okay, I can finally put this out. I'm okay with it. I recoup my money, and I'm on to something else.
There's a part 3 that I'll make, and that's not the next film that I'm going to shoot. So it could be a long time before I get to that. But I am enjoying this kind of live interaction with the audiences, and it is different. It sits in people's different minds differently, and people really appreciate it. Like I was just in Paducah, Kentucky, a week or so ago, and the people are very happy. Not everybody goes to Paducah, Kentucky, and I can feel that. Genuinely talking to people about things that I think are important or things that I'm passionate about, and they come back to the shows, and I can see that there's something that's genuinely happened that sits differently in their mind than if it was just something they watched on their computer.
Now are you on the road full time with this?
No.
How many days a year do you do this?
Well, I own a house in Los Angeles, and I own the property in the Czech Republic. I'm last year and this year I spent more time in the Czech Republic because I've been building the sets than at my house in Los Angeles. But ultimately, I'm on the road more than either of those places, or I'm acting in other people's films. I'm very rarely in a city more than 2 weeks in a row. But I've been trying to make it so it's seasonal. Like this is my spring tour. So I'm touring for about a month, and as you can hear, I'm a bit hoarse. It's hard. It's not an easy lifestyle. But I've been trying in the last couple of years to have at least one tour per season where it's a month or two long. But it beats me up. It's hard. I'm glad to be doing it.
What I've noticed is you got incredible patience.
Yes.
How in this world that we live in do you have such incredible patience where we all want something immediately?
I've always been very patient.
Like you're building sets for, like you said, the last year and a half for a film that you're eventually going to shoot.
And I bought the property 9 years ago with this in mind.
Amazing.
So but it's also that I can see that if I go and I get money corporately, I've given up on doing that. They wouldn't fund what I'm interested in at all. And even if they were to pretend they were going to fund it, something would go wrong and there would be intervention. The only way to really own what the content of your film is to pay for it. And so I'm patient about that because I'm sincere in what my passions are about getting things across to people.
Things like that, though, like obviously you're very passionate about your art, what you do. Did you have to deal with the fact that you were in such an iconic character early in your career, George McFly, being that, like, after that, it would have seemed to me to be very hard to jump into things you're interested in now.
Well, but my interests that I'm interested in now started well before I was in Back to the Future. One of the books, which I wish I had with me, I had started making before I acted in Back to the Future, and I finished it. It's called Rat Catching. It was the first one I published. And I put it down while I was acting in Back to the Future and then finished it and published it a couple of years later as the first book I published. I'd made other books. But Back to the Future, it was actually very informative to me in some of the things that I'm talking about in terms of propaganda. I know it's a very beloved film, but I was only in the first film. There was they had taken the molds of my face from the old age makeup from the original film and put another actor into prosthetics that were made from my face. And then interspliced a very small amount of footage of me from the original film in order to fool audiences into believing that I was in the movie. Because of my lawsuit, there are rules in the Screen Actors Guild that make it so producers can never do something like that again. I'm proud of the lawsuit, but the reason I bring it up is because the reason that I didn't end up being in the film, it's more complex than this, but I was asking questions that the producer's director didn't like.
Right.
I actually did work again with Robert Zemeckis, strangely enough, when I did Beowulf, and had a very good working relationship with him. But there was a different end in the original draft that I read for the screenplay. When I auditioned for the part, I was only given what are called sides, the scene. Yep. So I got the part. I was 20 years old. I got the role. My agent told me I'd gotten this part, and I didn't really know everything about it, and I said, well, maybe I only knew that there was this other part that I was the scene I was doing the scene with. I said, well, should I go in for this other part? That seems like that could be a good part. He said, no, you don't understand. This is a really interesting role. You're going to be playing the older versions of this character in a different time period. And I thought, wow. I said, that's fantastic. Mm-hmm. I said, yeah, great. Let's close the deal. It's this big Universal Studios, produced by Steven Spielberg and directed by Robert Zemeckis. So great. So, but, I was a serious actor as well. So when I started actually analyzing the screenplay, once we were involved in the project, I had questions about things. And there was a different end. I won't go into so many details about it, but I had questions about it, and it did get changed. And I think there are other people that had questions because there are things in it that could, particularly in this day, be thought of as, well, offensive. And those changes happened. It had to do with money and what people were doing, the characters were doing with money. But I didn't stop with it. I said to Robert Zemeckis, I thought, it was not a good idea for our characters to have a monetary reward, because it basically makes the moral of the film be that money equals happiness. And by having there were various things that were doing it, but by having the son character cheer by having a truck in the garage, what I was arguing for was that the characters should be in love, and that the love should be the reward. By having any kind of monetary element as a reward, it makes it into a reward. I still feel the same way. I would like the film a lot better if there was no monetary, there could be signs of maybe monetary change would happen, but it was more important that the characters were in love. I would feel much better about the film, but by having those monetary rewards in it, it was a propaganda. And Zemeckis got really mad at me when I said this. And did
he yell at you?
He yelled. Yeah, he was,
wow. It's kind of odd discussing a film that old at this point. But didn't you see at the end the characters, they were more in love? I think, especially your character and the wife, they did seem to be.
But my argument is that part was good. I was all for it. But I think it pollutes it.
Do you think the money could have been a peripheral effect of the happiness that they had? I
think it's a bad message.
Really?
I do. I think because that's propaganda. That says to people, go out and borrow money for banks. This is a big part of why the film was successful, because the corporations knew that it had that moral element in it. Mm-hmm. Maybe. I would also argue, that's only because they knew that was in there, therefore they can feel comfortable in funding it and putting a lot of money into distributing it. Maybe if that wasn't in there, Zemeckis and Bob Gale would have not been able to sell it as readily. I don't know. But what I would still argue is that if that wasn't in there, and the only part that was in there was that they were in love, and that film still did get distributed as highly as it had, and have as much money behind it, I still think the film would be loved, and it would be, personally, I think it would have a better moral.
Why do you feel, since the character in there wasn't Crispin Glover, it was George McFly, do you feel you have to inject part of your
well, I was 20 years old.
Okay.
I was a young idealist. I wouldn't do that now. I wouldn't do that.
You wouldn't.
Well, at that time, I didn't even know. It was like I'd been in a few films, but not that many films. Mm-hmm. And I'd been in acting class where we did improvisations. I came up with scenes and thoughts. So I thought it was okay to be asking questions like that. Right. Now I understand very specifically that there's a lot of money and people have gone through a certain amount of troubles in Zemeckis. I'm sure.
Kids asking us goddamn questions. We're losing money here by the day.
Right. Well, I mean, to be fair, I wasn't stopping production.
Sure,
we were having a discussion during the time, but it's still. I wouldn't do that now. I fund my films with the working in corporate movies. I wouldn't. I know how things work at this point. Why I was bring it up was because it was informative to my thought process as to how propaganda does work, because I had this very early experience, and I was, it caused me to not be in the sequels on some level. I'm sure it's complicated, but and then there was a lawsuit. It was very specifically not a legal thing. I mean, you can just say it's not a nice thing, but it's not a legal thing to do either. So this informed me that if you question propaganda, it has serious consequences.
Can I ask you, when you mentioned Robert Zemeckis, when you talked to Zemeckis about what you thought that should have happened, how long into your explanation did you realize he was not happy? Like, did he hear you out, or did he interrupt you and go, look?
Well, it's a long time ago now. I remember one conversation very specifically, but what I am forgetting is that there might have been two parts to the conversation, because there was some part that I'm not going into the detail about that was changed. And it might be that then I continued on because they changed one thing, and I said, but there's still this monetary aspect. And so he probably was not happy about it. Right, they'd already done a change, and I think, but I'm forgetting now. It was that part was a while back. But it's also, there's also a part when you're working on a film that, on some level, it doesn't happen every day, but you do become passionate about things that you want to get done. It's normal for actors and directors, not all the time, but it's relatively normal to say, look, this is really important. You speak it out passionately, they speak it out passionately, and then you say, okay, that's fine. Then you shake hands and go. But you can have passionate conversations, and it doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to turn into some terrible thing years later. But I mean, and my experience in the business has been good. That would be the one real exception. That wasn't good. That was not a pleasant thing to have happen, because people still believe that was me. And the reason I had the lawsuit, it was the primary reason that I had it was I just wanted people to know that I wasn't in that. That wasn't me, because I didn't. If I had played that part, I would have played it differently. Right. I didn't like the way that guy played it, and people think that's me. I didn't either. Well, I mean, It still gets to me that there's that confusion, and what way is there to let it be known other than do that? So even still, that's why whenever the issue, anything about that's brought up now, I do talk about it. I'm talking about it more also because there's one fella, he might have even been on your show, I'm not sure, Bob Gale. Yeah,
Bob Gale was on.
Yeah, I think I listened to it. And on your show, he lied. He lied about some. Yeah, and you guys automatically believed what he said.
Oh, man, reconcile it, please.
Well, what he said was that I had... let me just be specific and let me think. He said that I had asked for the same amount of money that Michael J. Fox was getting in the film. It's total fabrication. The reason that he's doing this is because he wants to throw the track off of the conversation of that what they had done was illegal. So he's trying to justify as to why it was good for them to do this illegal thing. And so then people automatically believe, I remember what he said specifically was that then I had called back after the thing was in production saying, I want to do it or something. Oh, right. And somebody corroborated and went, oops, or something like that. It was like, I didn't do that. I actually did work on a different film at the time, a John Borman film. But what happened in the negotiation was I actually wanted to be in the film, but the offer was less than half of what Leah Thompson and Tom Wilson, who had similar-sized roles. Sure, yeah. And it wasn't fair. My agents didn't think it was fair, and it was a sequel. I got paid the same amount or more than what I was being offered for Back to the Future to do this other film. So it was just like a monetary, and of course this was a gigantically well-grossing film,
Huge,
but it's also why did they do that? It's because I read a great book I recommend anybody read called How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. I only read it like in the 2000s. I wish I'd read it when I was like a teenager. But one of the things that he really illustrates well is don't prove people wrong. And that's essentially what I was doing when I was having that argument with Zemeckis about that there was a moral issue here. I was just thinking I was being like this, it was a good moral of what I was arguing for, and I thought they'd see my point,
Yeah.
But I realized on some level that I was, and especially with a lawsuit, I proved people wrong. When you do something like that, then they come on the Opie and Anthony show and make lines up about you.
And make up things. Oh, my God.
Well, we just assumed he was telling the truth.
Yeah.
Which I think a lot of people do.
I thought he was lying, but you guys were like, no, it sounds truthful to me. I'm like, all right.
Shut it, Jim. Never said that.
I didn't lie for a second, though. These guys are very gullible.
What do you think of Steven Spielberg?
Well, first off, Robert Zemeckis, I think, can make interesting films. The second film that I did with him, Beowulf, which was written by Neil Gaiman and Roger Avary, I thought had very good moral elements in it. It was about lies, which I have a lot of interest in, and they did something very interesting with that film. I think Zemeckis can get into a dark comedic territory that's very interesting. I liked what Death Becomes Her, and he can be interesting. I tend toward feeling like Steven Spielberg really does work very much in propaganda, and it's very well hidden. Like I was saying a little bit about kind of war. If you analyze Steven Spielberg's films about war, they're essentially pro-war films, and I don't think that's good at this point in time to do. You look at a great war film like All Quiet's on the Western Front, or Paths of Glory by Kubrick, or Full Metal Jacket by Kubrick. They all are it's obviously not proper, happy ideas about war. These are highly questioning. War is there's no question. War is a horrible thing. And you look at something like Saving Private Ryan, which is a very well-liked film, but essentially it's arguing that there's such a thing as a moral war or a good war. And maybe you can make that argument. I just think it's a bad argument to make, especially at this point in time. I don't think I wouldn't want to do that. I don't understand why somebody in a power situation like that is making films that are saying it's good to be going to war. Why do that? Why?
Right.
I mean, I'm sure there's all kinds of people,
and
veterans and things that. My father's a veteran. My father was in the Korean War, but it was like he explained very clearly to me when the Vietnam War was going on. I was a kid. I saw those awful images. My father said to me, war was horrible. It's like he didn't have any like glory stories about being in the war, and he was in bad situations. So, I maybe I'm a bleeding heart pacifist, but I just think it's not good to be making pro-war films. So I question.
And Spielberg is a powerful man that doesn't need the money. So I think your point is he could take all that power and do a more positive message.
People could argue that Private Ryan, though, was it did show a lot of the horrors of war.
Yeah, but still when you analyze it, somehow there's a positive element about aspects of the war, and I don't think it's a good message to put out. Which is a similar argument with Back to the Future.
Sure, yeah.
There are interesting elements in Back to the Future. The structure is excellent. It's part of why I had strong arguments, because I could see what that moral element was, and I knew it would have effect within the culture, or I felt it would.
Yeah.
And so when you analyze those things, it's like, you've got a lot of money, you've got a lot of power. Do something that's going to genuinely affect the culture at large in a very positive way. And I suppose, I'm sure, I would assume Steven Spielberg feels like he was doing something positive. I would argue that it would be much more positive if there was a clear anti-war message.
You ever think, though, sometimes that there are, there's filet mignon and then there's a steakum from your freezer. Like some things are just made to be
you can argue
consumed.
but
consumed.
I
think really tasting it.
I can't help but be analytical. It's just my nature.
Yeah, obviously.
And when you look overall at our culture, it's easy to study something like Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany and condemn those things, rightfully so. But terrible things went on in those cultures with propaganda. But it's more difficult for our culture to analyze our own propaganda, especially in the media. But I think it's important to do it, and because I think our culture's media is much more well oiled than even Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany, because people don't notice it, and so things like saying, well, it's just, this is a fun movie or all that, there is. I enjoy movies that I'm sure would be strong propaganda as well. Just because something's propaganda doesn't mean it's not a good movie. But I think it's really important to have the discussion so that people are aware of this. And I don't really see the discussion happening in our specifically about film, which is what I'm most passionate about.
Yeah.
It happens in other areas a little bit about politics and things like that, but I again, as this young idealist, when I was 16, I wanted to be a part of this industry that was questioning things. I'd like it to come back.
Now, do you think there's a director out there kind of in the mainstream that's doing it right?
I think there are a lot of directors that are passionate and want to do it. And
any films that were pretty popular that you're like, yes, they're doing it right. That's a positive message for our culture.
Maybe I hesitate to point to things, but there are I can tell there's some directors working in the corporate industry that are striving really hard, and every once in a while there is a film that'll come out and that asks questions for real and is artful, and anytime a director has stuck with it and done it, I stand up and applaud.
You don't want to mention one, though?
Amazing feat.
Do you want to mention one?
Well, the ones I more think of are not big popular films. I very much like Gaspar Noé's Enter the Void, but that's not a big, huge popular film. I thought that was a really well-made film. I see things that happen in the corporate films that there are some very good directors that I'd love to work with, but it's I get nervous about getting into putting examples, because then people can easily say, well, this film did this and this, and I might agree with them. So because I can see that even when somebody's really striving hard, maybe there are reasons why it didn't go as hard as it could have gone.
Understand.
But I mean, again, I'm so glad to be a part of the industry, and I want to work with people. I don't want to be. It's difficult for me to talk like this, because I feel like so many people are friends with Spielberg or Zemeckis, and they think I'll never work with this guy. He's a jerk. I'm sure
nobody in this room is friends with those guys. Believe me.
Well, but like Bob Gale was on the show, so it's like it does happen, and I.
You set the record straight today. I'm glad.
Absolutely.
I'm glad. And we apologize for that.
No,
I don't know.
It's not your fault.
We didn't have your phone number.
It's not. I mean, why wouldn't people think something's true? But the reason I point to it specifically is he was involved in something that, I've seen, even when I use the word illegal, that people go, oh, drama queen. But very specifically, I saw somebody write those words.
I have them tattooed over my ass.
but very specifically, it was illegal, and so and he was a prime architect of that illegal activity. So there's a motive to make something seem, like it was justified to do this, and that's why he's saying these things.
Should have just looked at him and just said, "Now don't con me, Bob."
Yeah, I mean, he's the guy. He said a lot of things. It's not just that. There are negative things that have been said to me and then about me on the Blu-rays that are not true. And
a commentary, really?
Yeah. He said things that are like. I haven't listened to it all in completion myself, but I've had people come up and say, "Did this, and this?" I said, "Where did you hear that?" And they said, "On the commentary on the Blu-ray for Back to the Future." And it's always from him. It's not from Robert Zemeckis. It's not. I mean, Steven Spielberg doesn't comment at all.
No.
but
anything.
Bob Gale still is. That's his main career at this point as well. He doesn't really write films anymore. He's not involved in the industry other than having to do with things having to do with Back to the Future. So I think the fact that there was this lawsuit and he has a lot of focus specifically on that film series. He has a lot going on in his mind about it, specifically that there was an illegal action and it's in the public record, so he has to justify it.
It is just an odd thing that the movie did become so beloved in American
well, and part of it is part of it is that there are good structural elements, there are interesting things in it, and unfortunately, that element. There are other movies that in the history of U.S. filmmaking that do similar elements with their structure, where it seems as though it's about love, but there's a monetary reward, and they're very popular films.
I think a lot of people see it though as, boy, who wouldn't want to go back in time and change things
really
for the better when you then come back and you're like, wow, I fixed it.
That part's great. Part that's a big part of why it's and that's what's also was my argument about it. It's like all of this stuff is great. Why do you need to put this monetary reward in it? It would make it such a more pure message of love instead of dirtying it up with a messy element.
You'd have rather seen a '67 Falcon in that garage.
I would have rather not. That didn't happen. I would have just rather that there was, and there, the scene was also reshot. There was a different actor playing the part originally. Eric Stoltz originally played the part, and then Michael J. Fox replaced him. We had already shot the sequence that I'm talking about, the alternate future, and I had played it slightly differently. And then they fired back to Eric Stoltz, and I thought I was going to get fired as well. But Robert Zemeckis made it very clear that he wanted me to play it quite relatively different than I had played it originally. And at the point that we shot the alternate future the second time, when we shot that scene, I would call it acting from the spinal cord. I was afraid. I was genuinely afraid.
Really?
Oh yeah, I thought I was going to get fired if I didn't do exactly what they said. I didn't want. I was 20. I didn't want to get fired. I wasn't looking for controversy. I wanted to do a good job.
How would you have liked to have seen that ending play out? If you had say,
the only thing was that I didn't think that there should have been monetary the kind of clothes we were wearing.
When that's what I was getting into. So when they walk in, they've been playing tennis, and they have nice clothes on. Yeah. Like all that was.
I thought it all pointed toward this idea that happiness was about wealth. It made me really uncomfortable. What I was wearing, holding a tennis racket, I did it because I thought I was going to get fired. But I vocalized that I didn't think this was a good idea. And I think there's even might be some commentary on the Blu-ray about where they said, "Oh, Crispin didn't like his clothes." I didn't care about the clothes. It was like I cared about the message, and so that was a very specific message. I didn't write. I wouldn't do it now.
Obviously,
I wouldn't make that complaint now. I would have looked at the whole screenplay. I would have analyzed what was going on. I would have known, okay, there's this element of propaganda, and maybe I'll say something, and if they don't want to do it, fine. But I was 20 years old is really quite young.
I hear you. You just don't understand how compelling this is for me to ask you this.
Sure, I'm glad to talk about it.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because I think the happiness and how do you show success? He went from being, the goofy kind of loser guy to being very successful because of what happened in that moment.
Well,
how do you show the success part?
There's a million ways you can do it. But we're not. It could take days to really sit and figure out exactly what it is. It's not something that I'm prepared to say exactly what the illustration of it would be. I'm sure there would be a cinematic illustration of
sure.
of love and success that would work, and I don't have that answer at this moment.
And was it odd that Biff would be around the house at all, seeing what he did?
Well, see, that's part of what the change was from what I originally read in the screenplay. There were different people. It wasn't Biff that was the servant to the family, and I had questions about it, and it did get.
Do they have slaves or something?
I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but
that's the first thing I thought of when you said that.
I know. Well, I don't want to go into a lot. I am actually in the. I'll write it down in a book at some point.
I'd love to read it, Crispin.
but for now, I do hope I'll get to see and talk to people at the Museum of Art and Design. And if you can tell people, CrispinGlover.com has the list of where I'm going to be.
Yeah, CrispinGlover.com. I want to go see this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You sold us on this.
Oh,
we were very confused. We're not going to lie to you before we came in, trying to figure this whole thing out.
Yeah.
But you're going to be showing 2 films?
Yeah.
Well, on subsequent nights. Tomorrow night I'll be showing It Is Fine, Everything Is Fine.
Right.
Which is part 2 of the trilogy. Then part 1, you don't have to see it in order. Then part 1 will be showing, I guess it's on Saturday at the Museum of Art and Design.
I definitely want to, I mean, the YouTube clips we saw were really good.
Yeah, I'm proud of these films. You know, I didn't.
What not for YouTube?
I think there are, you can see clips of it on CrispinGlover.com. It's probably easier. I think there's some nudity that it would get taken down on YouTube.
Crispin.
But
how dare you!
I gotta say thank you so much for coming in. This is
really
fantastic.
appreciate it. Yeah, it's great to talk to you.
And you made us burn something on disc. You want us to play this or
whatever you want to play? That's a reading that I did on an album that came out in the '80s. It's a little bit different than what I perform at the shows because there's no music and I perform it differently. I was much younger when I did that, but it gives a kind of an idea of what some of the live performances about for radio because there's a visual component, of course, that's not there. But I bring it when I come in on radio shows.
Right. All right. Which one can we play out of this?
So either selected readings of Rat Catching or selected readings from probably selected readings of from Oak Mott is a nice one, or either one.
All right. E-Rac's going to play it into break for us.
Crispin Glover and Crispin Glover on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Come on back.
Yeah. Well, great.